So you mentioned how recently the U.S. government put out some additional instruction regarding who is a domestic violent extremist, I believe is their terminology. And it's funny because I think that originally this may have been sold as, the Biden administration being vigilant against right-wing extremists, especially in the wake of the January 6th riot at the Capitol. However, if you actually look at the guidance, it's pretty much anyone who may oppose the government for any reason. So they mention animal rights activists, they mention opponents to capitalism, they mention people who think that the government may be corrupt. So really just the gambit of any reason whatsoever where you may have a problem with the government apparently makes you a domestic violent extremist. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit on that guidance and what the ramifications of it may be.
Yeah, so the war on domestic terror is not something that just Biden started. This is something that's been the U.S. establishment has been trying to implement for decades. In terms of what we're seeing now, that policy really has its roots in the Reagan administration as this very controversial aspect of the Iran-Contra scandal that's known as continuity of government protocols, and a database that basically contains a lot of intelligence on innocent Americans who are deemed as to be dissidents by the states. That database is known as Main Core. It still exists today. Basically, it was originally created during the Reagan era because they wanted to potentially detain people in the U.S. that they thought would resist U.S. military intervention in Nicaragua or more broadly in Latin America during the Reagan years. And one of the trigger events they cite for implementing continuity of government protocol, which is suspension of the Constitution, martial law, and all of that stuff, in addition to detaining people who haven't committed a crime for their political views. They did say that popular nonviolent opposition to a U.S. military intervention abroad fell in that category, which is very disconcerting. But of course, it didn't get a lot of coverage. Some of the people involved in continuity of government were in the Reagan administration when it first started, were people like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who were in power in the Bush administration. Allegedly, continuity of government protocols were activated for an unspecified amount of time in the wake of September 11th. And of course, after 9/11 in the White House, people saw Main Core being accessed at the White House for whatever reason. It later came out that apparently Main Core was used to increase surveillance and among other things that we don't know happened of potential, subversives and dissidents in the U.S. after 9/11. For whatever reason. But of course, before 9/11, you had this major pivot by people that would, again, serve in the Bush administration, people like Richard Armitage, for example, the National Defense Panel in 1997, basically being responsible for this pivot towards homeland defense and homeland security in the late 90s that definitely got the national security state moving in the years leading up between then and 9/11 to basically develop this pivot towards homeland defense. That's why months before 9/11 took place, legislation was actually introduced to create what is now the Department of Homeland Security. Originally, it was the National Homeland Security Agency, I believe, is proposed, and that legislation, I believe, was introduced in either March or May of 2001, because this pivot was planned, well in advance, regardless of 9/11 or not. But obviously 9/11 did manufacture consent for the implementation of something like the Department of Homeland Security, as it's now called. But I would argue, if you look at Richard Armitage, for example, who was responsible for this, Richard Armitage's history with in U.S. politics, in the Bush administration, he was a major advisor on foreign policy in the war on terror. But, in his earlier career, he was involved in the CIA domestic dissident, or rather dissident hunting program in Vietnam called the Phoenix Program, that was basically laid a lot of the groundwork for what later the Reagan administration would secretly plan to try and do in the U.S. domestically, right? So a lot of people that were involved in the Phoenix Program for various reasons were also involved in these efforts to create the Department of Homeland Security. You can only imagine why they thought that might be necessary, but obviously they didn't like having domestic of dissent about their policies, specifically when they feel like these policies are essential to things like maintaining American military and economic hegemony into the foreseeable future, which is something, for example, the Project for a New American Century, or PNAC, which of course also had Cheney, Rumsfeld, and a lot of the Paul Wolfowitz and a lot of the guys that planned the Iraq War, and were very prominent in the Bush administration, said very explicitly in this document called Rebuilding America's Defenses in September 2000 that a bunch of things had to change and be done in order for the U.S. to maintain hegemony, and that there would need to be a galvanizing, catalyzing event, a new Pearl Harbor, for those things to be basically pushed through on a much shorter timeline than it would take otherwise. More recently, under the Trump administration, we saw a lot of moves to, obviously you have a lot of people from the Bush and Reagan administrations also serving in the Trump administration, right? So you had this policy advance to a significant degree as well, specifically thanks to Bill Barr at the Department of Justice, who introduced a pre-crime program that a lot of people don't know about. I wrote about it when it was first announced in October 2019 for Mint Press News. I think literally the only other outlet that covered it was the Ron Paul Liberty Report. No one else was very interested in the story at the time. Of course, that was implemented just a few months later at the beginning of 2020. It's called DEEP. The Disruption and Early Engagement Program, I believe is what it stands for. And sort of this pre-crime approach and all of that, and DEEP as well. A few months before DEEP was announced, Bill Barr gave a speech saying we need a backdoor into encryption, and we basically need pre-crime. But it's not popular. But sometime soon there will be a galvanizing event that will rally Americans around these things. And then there was, of course, we had a spate of mass shootings shortly after that, including the El Paso Walmart shooting, which has very unsettling, unanswered questions about FBI foreknowledge as well, that I also wrote about for Mint Press at the time. And then you have Bill Barr come in with the solution to those crises with the DEEP program. And during that period as well, Trump was also considering creating a health DARPA agency, or HARPA, that was specifically going to monitor Americans' communications, specifically on social media, for signs of neuropsychiatric warning signs that someone might be mobilizing towards violence for whatever reason, which is, and of course that was actually going to be AI that was managing that. And actually Biden just a couple months ago announced that they're going to be doing HARPA, though they might call it ARPA-H instead of HARPA, and that the science advisor for the Biden administration, the main one, Eric Lander, who was funded by Jeffrey Epstein and is controversial for numerous reasons, as I've written about recently, is going to be in charge of that effort, and will obviously be rolled into this war on domestic terror as Biden has outlined it. So Trump didn't adopt that policy, but Biden is going to. And of course, you also had during the Trump administration lots of calls from his supporters to go after Antifa, quote unquote, terrorists and all of this stuff on the left. And then you have people at the time, too, in Congress on the Republican side pushing legislation to criminalize, what was going on there, while you have people on the left later, with January 6th and all of this, calling for people on the right to be labeled terrorists. For a number of reasons, and you definitely have it coming from both sides of the political party, this push to label people on the other side of the political spectrum terrorists, right? So, but really what the national security state wants at the end of the day is that anyone, the justification to really go after anyone who's a threat to the status quo and a threat to their power. And so that's what we see in the, it's interesting because Biden brags about all the time how he's always been so good about working with the other party and reaching across the aisle, right? And you really see that here in this domestic terror strategy, how the people that the GOP think are terrorists and the people that the Democrats think are terrorists are all labeled terrorists together in this new document. And basically, as the U.S. has done before with the war on terror, it's just ripe for abuse to a significant degree. And as you mentioned, it's been publicly justified as the Biden administration going after domestic extremists that are right-leaning or racially motivated. But if you read the strategy, which I really recommend everyone does, it says, on par with those extremists are people deemed by the government to be anti-government or anti-authority for a variety of reasons. And when they actually get to the business of explaining who they think anti-authority and anti-government extremists are, a lot of people that are on the left would fall in there, specifically socialists or people, communists, people that oppose capitalism or want to replace it with another system, fall in that category, according to the Biden administration. So a lot of people, on the left that have bought the public justification for what this is for, I would really encourage them to look at this strategy seriously and then revisit the history of these types of campaigns as they've been conducted in other countries backed by the U.S. government, like Operation Condor and the Phoenix program, which were used to go after the left. With the full backing of the U.S. government. Operation Condor, for example, was a multinational domestic dissident elimination campaign that went on in the military dictatorships of Chile, Argentina, Brazil, I believe Peru, and several other countries in South America cooperated with this, but it was all planned by the CIA. The targets were people that were either leftists, communists, socialists, or suspected leftists. And so, having lived in Chile and heard a lot of stories from Chileans about this period of history that didn't end so long ago, people could just be disappeared by the state for being accused of leftist sympathies, among other things. If someone hated their neighbor and wanted them to just go away, they'd just say whatever and it would happen. So it's really disconcerting. And we've also seen, statements from the Biden administration about the role of family members and friends basically snitching on people they think are too extreme or have the wrong political views as part of this war on domestic terror. And I really would encourage people to study the history because the U.S. has done this in other countries before, and it has never been pretty, either for civil liberties or for the left, which is currently people that identify as left tend to be the people that are cheerleading this war on domestic terror from the Biden administration more than anyone else. So I would really caution them against that. And that's really why I made a focus of my more recent article on this, about that in particular, because this is not about going after quote unquote right-wing terror. This is about going after anyone that could present any sort of threat to the U.S. establishment as it enters this phase where, the business sector and all of this is going to move towards automation. There's going to be a lot more economic inequality, even more than there is now, especially with a lot of the economic issues that the U.S. is facing, including creeping inflation, among other things. So it's definitely, the U.S. government is aware that things are going to get rockier down the line, and they want this infrastructure in place because they don't want people to come together and make a new system that challenges their power, right? So they have a specific system they want to implement, and they don't want people to get in the way of that, essentially. And I really think that's where this war on domestic terror comes from. And also, I think we may see some sort of event that is aimed at basically manufacturing consent for this to be implemented on a more broad, more public level, because I think a lot of people right now aren't really, the fear levels aren't high enough for a system like this to work. I think it needs some sort of like 9/11 style event for people to really get on board with a big war on domestic terror and have this play out the way it's been written out. But, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the stuff, the policies that were implemented after 9/11 were introduced months before 9/11, right? So, that's definitely a concern to me, that I think that if, the national security state feels like they don't have enough consent from the public to implement this policy, or at least a particular sector of the public, they'll go to extreme lengths to get that consent, whatever that looks like. I don't really know. But it's definitely a concern of mine because this is obviously a policy they plan to implement and an infrastructure they want to put in place and that they plan to put in place. They've already earmarked lots of money for it and already set things up. And this is also, by the way, something that is not just exclusive to the government. The strategy makes it clear that this is all being done in collaboration with the private sector and Silicon Valley. It emphasizes the tech sector, but the private sector is going to be involved as well. So you mentioned animal rights activists being put on this list as well. What if big ag, feedlots and all of that stuff will be like, oh, these are people that have broken in and filmed the bad conditions that we in which we house animals, and they get added to the domestic terror list. I mean, this collaboration between the public and private sector on something of this degree is not really good, obviously, because it definitely if it's not outright fascism, it's certainly something quite close to it when you're basically colluding with the private sector to put people on a list that could lead to the loss of their liberty or even their life, depending on how extreme this ends up getting. So definitely a lot to be concerned about here, because once we give the government this sort of power, it's very rare for it to come back. Even in the wake of 9/11, a lot of the security measures that were implemented at airports that have been proven to be just for show, really, or obedience training in the years since were never taken away. The no-fly list was allowed to continue to exist despite it being untransparent and people that are put on there having no way to appeal how to get off easily. Among other things, a lot of these losses of civil liberties that happened during the War on Terror were never returned, though it wasn't necessarily obvious to people domestically, but I think this time it definitely will be. And the U.S. public is going to be in a very dicey place if they don't learn the history of this quickly, because the U.S. government has shown its cards before on who it likes to target and what it plans to do in these types of scenarios and in these wars of, domestic terror and what have you. And so, if you agree that the war on terror was a disaster, why would you give, the same people essentially license to do it domestically, where it's going to directly impact your life and your family's life? It doesn't really make any sense to me.